we do a lot of single cell spatial work, so I can't even talk without talking about single cell and spatial work. So we mined public single cell data as well as generated our own site-seq data, where we took dissociated single cells from mucosal biopsies, looked at the enrichment for the vascular inflammation signature, found them to be very unique to SPP1 positive macrophages, well-established macrophage population. But with the site-seq data, we were able to actually look at the expression of the end target of vedolizumab, alpha-4 beta-7. And what we saw was that the SPP1 negative macrophages had significantly different expression relative to the SPP1 positive macrophages, and SPP1 positive macrophages had significantly lower expression for alpha-4 beta-7 in the mucosal tissue. There had always been this background question as to whether vedolizumab interacted with macrophages or monocytes to alter the priming of them as they entered the tissue, and whether that may contribute to mechanisms of treatment resistance. So what we then did is we took public single cell and spatial data. We looked at all the monocytes in the peripheral blood and the tissue monocyte macrophage populations, looked at the module score, which I mentioned with the vascular inflammation signature, and then SPP1 specifically. You can see across every data set and across even the tissue spatial single cell and single cell data set, there are two very unique populations that are emerging, with an SPP1 dominant macrophage being specifically associated with non-responders to vedolizumab across multiple independent cohorts through public data. So then we said, okay, this looks to be real. We have a baseline biomarker of non-response. We have a molecular source with SPP1 macrophages, but how are the SPP1 macrophages promoting that resistance? So we started doing cell-cell interaction work and spatial assessments, and what you can see here on the left is that these SPP1 macrophages in non-responders relative to SPP1 macrophages in responders had a substantially higher cellular interaction within their environment that was potentially promoting that mechanism of resistance. And this is across 3 independent cohorts, 2 public and 1 that we created on our own here as a new data set. When we started looking at what these specific interactions were for SPP1 macrophages in these non-responders, we found a very specific interaction between SPP1, alternative integrins, so alpha-9, alpha-3, but also beta-1 and alpha-5, and angiopoietin-2. So angiopoietin-2 and SPP1 interactions are well established in the cardiovascular space for vascular inflammation, and it's been well established to be associated with the renin-angiotensin system. So then we started looking at some of the niche signatures and how these macrophages may be co-localizing with alternative cells, and you can see here that these SPP1 macrophages were strongly enriched along the endothelial space in non-responders relative to responders, and this was unique to SPP1 macrophages and not seen for any other subtype of cellular sources. So now we've started to whittle down that these SPP1 macrophages appear to be interacting with the endothelium, specifically in non-responders through well-established axes that have been demonstrated in cardiology through angiopoietin-2 and alternative integrins. So it brought up the question, are these SPP1 macrophages promoting resistance through the upregulation of alternative integrin trafficking pathways that allow for escape and essentially evasion of the alpha-4 beta-7 pathway? That's indeed what's happening. So what we saw was that, as I mentioned, some of those axes are well established for the renin-angiotensin system. And so these SPP1 macrophages in the non-responders had significantly higher angiotensinogen, the precursor to angiotensin 1. What was notable, however, was they had very low renin. So there's some well-demonstrated data about renin bypassing mechanisms for angiotensinogen conversion. One of them is cathepsin D. And so in ulcerative colitis and in colitis, cathepsin D is only induced and upregulated during inflammation. And so what we found is that these SPP1 macrophages were specifically located in cathepsin D positive and high spatial niches, which created the question of whether this renin bypassing mechanism was allowing for angiotensinogen to be converted to angiotensin 1, and then through the classic pathway angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and whether we could think about ways to target that through ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers. Notably, that this pathway has also been well established to upregulate an alternative integrin known as ICAM1. So I mentioned that vedolizumab targets alpha-4 beta-7 MADCAM1 interactions. So we did spatial multiomics with protein immunofluorescence, and this is the endothelium, and you can see the purple light up for ICAM1. This is an SPP1 macrophage right next to it, which we confirmed on transcriptional profile, and there's this huge interaction that's occurring across this really strongly positive ICAM1 endothelium in the gut. And when we quantified this spatially in our lab, we saw that indeed the ICAM1 expression in the endothelium spatially near these SPP1 positive, angiotensinogen positive cells was significantly higher than in the responders, and we were not seeing differences for MADCAM1. So this further sort of helped confirm this underlying hypothesis that led to the sort of next phase, which is that these SPP1 angiotensinogen 1 macrophages, which are low in alpha-4 beta-7, evade vedolizumab through this angiotensin 2 ICAM production, and we have an alternative independent trafficking mechanism that allows for continued inflammation, and maybe ACE inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers could be used to specifically improve outcomes for vedolizumab. So we accessed Trinetics, a large electronic medical record-based data set of over 3,000 ulcerative colitis patients with hypertension. We looked at propensity score matched analysis of vedolizumab plus ACE and ARB or anti-TNF or ustekinumab anti-IL-12/23 therapy plus minus ACE inhibitor or ARB. What you can see here is the treatment persistence, ability to stay on therapy, UC-related hospitalization, and colectomy-free survival. In patients on vedolizumab who were on an ACE inhibitor or ARB, they had there was a significant reduction in, if you were not on the ACE inhibitor or ARB, you had a reduction in your likelihood for persistence. If you were not on the ACE inhibitor or ARB, you had a significant reduction for, you had a much higher probability for hospitalization, and essentially the ACE inhibitor or ARB was protective against risks for hospitalization, colectomy, and improved persistence rates. We did not see that benefit for anti-TNF therapy, we did not see that benefit for ustekinumab, and we did not see a benefit for calcium channel blockers or beta blockers for vedolizumab. But that's just one cohort. So we validated it again in another claims-based data